of our conspiracy program on Financial Sense is the Council on Foreign Relations. Dr. Dennis Cuddy is an historian and political analyst, as well as being author of the book The Globalists and a number of other books, as a matter of fact. Dr. Cuddy received his Ph.D. from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. He has been a political and economic risk analyst for an international consulting firm, as well as a senior associate with the U.S. Department of Education. He has authored or edited 20 books and has written hundreds of articles appearing in major newspapers around the country, and for many years was a frequent guest on radio and TV talk shows. Dr. Cuddy, we're focusing today on the CFR for purposes of the program, but the Council on Foreign Relations, the brainchild of Colonel Edward Mandell House in 1921, it wasn't originally called by that name, was it?
No, for a brief period, it had another name. Actually, what it is, I believe in your look at organizations, you've looked at the Cecil Rhodes and his plan, and the CFR was actually an outgrowth of the Rhodes Plan, and it's the American counterpart of the Royal Institute for International Affairs in England for a very short period after Colonel House and the rest of those people, Walter Lippmann and the Dulles brothers, met at the Majestic Hotel over in Paris. It was known by another name, but just for all intents and purposes, it was shortly changed thereafter to the House's group was known as the Inquiry, to the Council on Foreign Relations, and that's the way most people know it today.
Well, just a couple of years earlier, President Woodrow Wilson gave an address in Minneapolis. He referred to the Charter of the League of Nations. Remember, they just brought about the League of Nations after World War I as, quote, the Charter of the New Order of the World. So there's a very early reference to a New World Order. In other words, President Bush wasn't the first one to make that reference. And Colonel Edward Mandell House was, what, a shadow government behind, or a shadow man behind the president?
I call him an agent of the power elite. They're very powerful people, and they have their agents. You have your Colonel House for Woodrow Wilson. Later on, there'll be John J. McCloy and Henry Kissinger and Zbigniew Brzezinski. And those individuals are agents. They carry out the will of the power elite. If you look at Charles Seymour, who was a member of the Skull and Bones, Yale University, he has the intimate papers of Colonel House, is what they're called. And in there, he actually puts House's letters back and forth to various individuals, Paul Warburg, for example, saying, I'm steadying Wilson, I'm keeping in line. He will do this, as we want him to in foreign policy or with the Federal Reserve. So House is always reporting to these individuals of how he's managing Wilson very well.
But why did Mandell House, he was what would you say he was the driver of the creation of the CFR?
Oh, yes, yes.
Okay, why did they do that? Because of the failure of the League of Nations?
Well, let me go back just a little bit regarding what I said about the Cecil Rhodes. His plan was that from which the CFR came. Very briefly, Rhodes had the secret society, the Society of the Elect, and it had a secret circle of initiates, a smaller group. A larger group was called the Association of Helpers, and they were semi-secret. They formed round-table groups from the early 1900s. After Rhodes died, Lord Alfred Milner took up the plan and actually implemented it, and they formed round-table groups in Commonwealth nations as well as the U.S. and Germany. And they were sort of think tanks of the day, discussion groups, but because it was semi-secret, they would publish what their formal papers, but secretly they were really up to some other things. And I put, for example, quotes about the secret part in my Globalist book. And those groups, the roundtable groups, were basically the foundation of the effort in World War I. And, we can go into how they manipulated that and actually caused the war at some later point. And so afterwards, the whole idea in developing the peace and what Colonel Edward Mandell House managed is Wilson's 14 points, part of which was this League of Nations. And so they needed some sort of driving force. And in England, they came up with the Royal Institute of International Affairs, and then the CFR was its counterpart. And so after the CFR was founded in 1921, because the League and the 14 points sort of foundered, it was blocked by Senator Henry Cabot Lodge and some others. And so they said, well, we have to have some sort of propagandist machine to try to move this effort along, since we haven't gotten our way with America joining the League. The League was actually formed, but America did not join it. And so shortly thereafter, the Journal of the CFR, Foreign Affairs, Colonel House has an article in there where he talks about if war, meaning World War I, had not come in fierce and exaggerated form, which is what they caused, they actually wanted that, then we would not have been able to have this world organization effort such as the League.
You know, it's interesting you say that, because on May 7th of 1915, in Colonel House's private papers, he wrote that it was, quote, strange that at about 11:30 a.m. at Buckingham Palace, King George told him, and this is a quote from the papers, suppose Germany should sink the Lusitania with American passengers on board, end quote. At 2 p.m., May 7th, the same day, about 2 to 3 hours after King George's statement to Colonel House, Germany sank the Lusitania, which was carrying munitions and 128 American passengers, and of course that was the impetus for getting into war.
So basically, he let out of the bag what had been going on and what their plan was. And so what they decided to do was what we now know is a term. When I was in Washington, I was told this: personnel is policy. And it's absolutely critical to have your key people in key positions if you want anything done. And so the CFR started doing that. They started placing people and getting memberships in powerful positions. So by the late 20s, you had, let's say, William Paley was a CFR member when he formed CBS in 1928, and he immediately hired Edward Bernays, who was the father of public opinion. And Bernays, in that same year, had authored a book called Propaganda, where he actually came out and said, we know how to manipulate people. Without their knowing it, we will create the social forces which guide public opinion. He said, we actually are an invisible government, is the way Bernays said it. And they knew that they had to not only get people in place, but if this was a global idea, they had to control international finances. Now, House had already facilitated Woodrow Wilson's signing of the Federal Reserve for 1913, but they needed to bump this up to the international level. So a CFR director, Owen Young, came up with his plan, which then was called the Young Plan, and became part of the Hague Agreement of 1930, which formed the BIS, the Bank for International Settlements. For any of your listeners who aren't familiar with the BIS, Bank for International Settlement, it is the global central bank of all the world's countries' central banks. In other words, the Federal Reserve, the Bundesbank, the Bank of Japan, all the central banks in the world belong to this organization, which is very, very secretive and really sort of controls or can control international finance. And their plan went even further, very much like the Fabian Socialists, who you've already talked about. The Fabians networked with these people. To some extent, the Fabians were intellectual elites. They formed the London School of Economics to get people trained to go into government. So the prime ministers would come and go, but their bureaucrats, their socialists, would stay forever. And so they could do what they wanted to do, implementing Keynesian economics and so forth in England. Well, the same thing happened with the CFR in this country. They would not only get high-level members like William Paley to belong, and most of our presidents in the 20th century have belonged, but they also would get people in key government, especially foreign policy sort of decision-making positions. For example, the State Department. So by the early 40s, let me just read this quick quote here. There's a quote, I've got this letter, and it's contained in a book called Imperial Brain Trust. And this is a quote from September 14, 1942, and it's from a Harley Notter. And who's he? Well, he's Assistant Chief of the Division of Special Research, Department of State. And so this is what Notter is writing in the early 40s. He was concerned that relations with the Council on Foreign Relations, I have consistently opposed every move tending to give it increasing control of the research of this division. And though you, this is boss, Pazvolsky is his name, the boss, have also consistently stated that such a policy was far from your objectives, the actual facts already visibly show that the departmental control is fast losing ground. In other words, by the early 40s, the CFR had enough people in position to actually control the direction of a lot of the State Department initiatives. And it goes on from there. There's the next year, for example, you have a person named Chip Bohlen, B-O-H-L-E-N. Now, a lot of your listeners may not be familiar with him, but there was a book in 1986 by a Rhodes Scholar named Walter Isaacson, co-authored with Evan Thomas. I think he's the Washington editor of Newsweek magazine. And the book was titled The Wise Men. And it was about 6 men of the CFR, 6 of them, who, as they said, quote, shaped the New World Order. Now, remember, this is 1986. These 2 guys are writing about shaping the New World Order. And it said these 6 very powerful CFR people, people like, Dulles and John J. McCoy and so on. Well, one of the 6 is Bohlen, this guy. Now, why is this guy important? Well, this fellow is important not only for the ultimate objective of these individuals, the Fabian Socialists, the Skull and Bones, and the CFR members. But Chip Bolin made a statement about socialism. Their ultimate goal, of course, is the synthesis of Western capitalism and Eastern communism into a world socialist government. So he said, regarding socialism, this is Bolin, one of the 6 most powerful wise men, CFR members. He said, quote, maybe that is the road we ought to go down, in quote, socialism. Now, why is his opinion important? Well, he was like the right-hand man of FDR. FDR, December 1 of 1943, goes over to Tehran, Iran. He's there with a meeting with Stalin. Most of you listeners probably never heard of this because it was confidential, secret, classified information. But years later, about 20 years later, one could get access to this stuff. And so early in the 60s, access was made available by the government as to what really happened at Tehran. And so Bolin is there taking notes. And basically, this is what he said happened. FDR agrees with Stalin. Now, remember, this is long before World War II is over, December 1, 43. And he said FDR got along just fine with Stalin. FDR, as we know, had been very friendly to communists. He said some of his friends were communists. And FDR agreed to let Stalin have Poland after the war, and also going down the road, it would also lead to Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, that the Soviets would become in control of. Now, just think about that. FDR is saying, okay, the brutal dictator, Stalin, I'll just let you have Poland, but in December of 43, FDR has an election coming up. So he says to Stalin, he says, now keep this quiet. This deal we've got, it must be made secret. We must maintain secrecy because there's a lot of Polish Americans, and they wouldn't like this. They wouldn't like this secret deal I'm making with you, Joe Stalin. So keep this under your hat, but after the war, you can have Poland. And so Bolin is there as his right-hand man. He's taking all these notes down and, nodding his head, I guess, in approval of this thing. And so up until that point, the key effort of the CFR is moving along in that regard.
If we talk to people today, people will call it conspiracy theory if you say, well, this was the purpose of the founding of the CFR. But there are an awful lot of CFR members that seem to be in government, don't they? That's number one. But number two, do we have anything in the memoirs, again, about the people who founded it, going with Colonel House and others, where they made it very clear that this is the direction they wanted this organization to go? So that puts that little thing to bed.
Well, as I said right from the beginning, House, in one of the early Foreign Affairs articles, was talking about World War I, which these individuals, the agents of the power elite, actually created. Now, you can't say the CFR created World War I because it wasn't formed until later. But this is House. If war had not come in fierce, exaggerated form, then we would not be able to have this organization. I think there were like 60 members at the time that we called the League. Their purpose has always been this world government body.
So, in other words, they had a crisis, and he said, well, the war was actually a blessing in disguise because now it's driven everybody into the League. But, of course, as you said, Henry Cabot Lodge deep sixed that in the Senate when it came to ratification, which I don't think Woodrow Wilson ever forgave him for it.
No.
That deep sixed that. So they regrouped in 1921 and started the second effort, which would come to fruition after World War II, which was really World War I, Chapter 2.
Yeah, in fact, during World War II, early on, they kept talking about, quote, the United Nations. So they were planning for this long before 1945 in that conference in San Francisco.
But in terms of ongoing membership today, maybe something that I should ask is jump to the middle and maybe we can go back to where you were before, okay? Because is everybody who's in the CFR understand the long-term mission of the CFR?
No, a lot of people think of it as just a discussion group of informed individuals. What you got to remember is the CFR, like a lot of groups, and we don't have to go into the other groups, what they do is they have a coloring of respectability surrounding them. So if somebody would say, oh, you're a bunch of commie conspirators, or whatever it is, they can always point to individual A, B, and C who are perfectly legitimate, upstanding, church-going people in Des Moines or, wherever. So this makes it very, very difficult for somebody to say this group is about this. However, the leadership of the CFR, your directors and your vice directors and assistants and so forth at the very top, have pretty much always been globalists rather than the America First types. They've always had this global vision. Oftentimes it's a very benevolent vision. In fact, there's a book written about 1902 called Our Benevolent Feudalism, looking at America's future, because it would be like the old feudal days where you have the nobility at the top and they would take care of the peasants and the serfs and so forth, who would be the sort of chattel labor labor, worker bees like today for these individuals. And so there was always sort of a noblesse oblige attitude. We have the best education, the best breeding, the smartest people, the most money, and so forth. So we will help you poor people make the decisions that are necessary, although you may not see them as necessary at the time. We know best. Trust us. And so that's generally the direction of the higher-ups of the CFR or the Trilateral, whatever group you're talking about. They have that attitude. But 99% of the leadership have a globalist mind bent.